Hello and welcome to the Cambridge Festival 2021. I'm Chris Mann from BBC Radio Cambridgeshire, and my guest is Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, Professor of Psychology and Cognitive Neuroscience at the University of Cambridge. Sarah-Jayne, hello.
Hi.
I think, first of all, we should establish what exactly is adolescence, our discussion today on adolescent mental health. So adolescence probably starts earlier and ends a bit later than most people think.
Adolescence is actually really difficult to define. So we think about it as the period of life between childhood and adulthood. And for years, I used to define it as the period of life that starts with puberty and ends when you attain a stable, independent role in society. That definition works for me, but the problem is that there are really big cultural differences in terms of when young people become independent adults. In this culture over here in the UK, young people stay at home, they're not independent from their families, they're in full-time education right throughout their teenage years and often into their 20s. And that's not the case in many other countries around the world where children are expected to be independent, earn their own money, have babies as soon as they reach sexual maturity. So a couple of years ago, researchers in Australia, Susan Sawyer, and her colleagues, who are world experts on adolescence, wrote a paper in The Lancet suggesting that we globally define adolescence as the period of life between age 10 and 24 years. And that very broad developmental period was defined to reflect the fact there's a lot of biological changes, particularly in the brain and cognition, that spans that whole wide age range.
And what do we mean by mental health? And people use the expression good mental health, bad mental health. Is that correct language to use?
Well, I mean, mental health is just a way of describing the fact that mental health and mental illness is all on a continuum. It's not as if these mental health disorders or conditions like depression and anxiety and schizophrenia are circumscribed and completely separate from what all of us experience at some point in our lives. So we all have, experience of down times or anxious times, some of us more than others. That's completely normal. It's on a normal continuum. It's only at some point on that continuum where those experiences are really debilitating, where it becomes a problem and could be defined as a condition or a disorder.
It's fair to say that you're studying all of this, studying this cognitive psychology during probably the most exciting time there has been in your particular field, because now we can look inside a living brain. So what your understanding of it all has changed phenomenally.
Yes, so I can tell you a bit about the history, which is really interesting. So when I was an undergraduate 25 years ago, I was taught in my neuroscience courses that the human brain stops developing in childhood. I know that because I remember those lectures, and also I kept my undergraduate textbooks, and that's exactly what they say. They say the human brain develops for quite a long time up to about mid-childhood. Now we know now that that's completely wrong. And in fact, the human brain continues to develop right throughout childhood and throughout adolescence and even into early adulthood. And the reason we know that now, but we didn't know it 25 years ago, is because of advances in technology like MRI scanning. So we're now able, over the last 20 years, we've been able to scan the living human brain to track changes in both structure and function across the lifespan. And those studies, there are many, many of those studies that have been carried out in various different countries around the world, have shown time and time again that the brain changes both in terms of its structure, its composition, and also how it functions right throughout, for this very, very protracted period and in very substantial ways, right throughout adolescence and into the mid-20s or even the 30s in some cases.
So at your lab, you study the social brain. Tell us how you do that and what you're looking for.
So the social brain, I'm really interested in the social brain, mostly because I think of adolescence as a period of life where our social world changes so dramatically. Not only does the social environment change, like we go to, you know, from small primary schools to big secondary schools, and we're exposed to many, many more people, many more faces, and we have to kind of work out our way in these complex and unstable social hierarchies in secondary schools. But also we go through other social changes, like, for example, we go through puberty, which makes children look very different. They suddenly go from looking like small children to looking more like adults, and that makes society treat them differently. They're given more responsibility and more autonomy. But in addition to those environmental changes, there are also biological and cognitive changes. So we know, for example, that the parts of the brain that we use to understand other people's minds and to interact with other people, that's what we call the social brain, the network of brain regions that we use to interact with others, undergoes really substantial development during the period of adolescence. I mean, it's no different from other regions of the cortex, the surface of the brain. The whole cortex, apart from the sensory regions like the visual cortex, but the rest of the cortex, regions of the brain that are involved in decision making and planning and self-awareness and all sorts of other high-level cognitive processes, undergo really substantial protracted development during adolescence. And the social brain, which comprises 3 different regions of the cortex, is no different. It undergoes huge amounts of change across this period of life. And not surprisingly, social cognition, that is the sort of behavioral ability to understand other people, to take other people's perspectives, to understand other people's minds, also undergoes change during adolescence. And that's what we work on in my lab. And finally, one kind of culmination of all of this is that adolescents become particularly interested in their peers. Adolescence is a period of life where peers really matter, and peers' opinions matter in terms of the adolescent's own kind of self-evaluation and of self-worth, and perhaps matter more and more compared with in childhood, when maybe family opinions matter. And being accepted by peers really starts to matter in adolescence as well. And peer influence becomes a really big driver of adolescent decision-making and adolescent behaviour. So what I mean by that is adolescents become particularly interested in what their peers are doing, what the social norms are, what their peer group thinks, and might be influenced by that. So the classic example is peer influence on risk-taking. So if you think about risks that adolescents might sort of stereotypically take, we think of adolescents and we think of things like, I don't know, experimenting with smoking or drugs or alcohol or dangerous driving. Those are risks that adolescents don't tend to take when they're on their own. It's when they're with their friends.
So there's a group that we haven't mentioned yet, without whom none of this would be possible, of course, and that's parents. What role do they have to play, if any, in adolescence?
It's a really good question, and actually it's very complicated, because adolescents will try to, and you know, it's their kind of it's adaptive for adolescents to try to become independent of their parents. After all, that's what the period of adolescence is for. It's so that we can go through this developmental period and come out the other side as independent adults. So it's really important for adolescents to start being independent of their parents, to start making their own decisions, to start trying to have some kind of control over their environment. But this obviously can cause conflict. Parents don't really like that, because, I mean, some do, but many don't, because they're not used to it. They're used to their small child doing what they're told and going along with their parents, and suddenly they might have an adolescent who pushes back a bit and who wants to do their own thing, and particularly who wants to do what their mates are doing, what their friends are doing. But having said all that, parents are really, really important in adolescence. I mean, it's not as if, you know, a young teenager can suddenly completely make their own decisions and has the experience to know what to do in every situation. Parents play, well, my colleagues and I who work on the adolescent brain, we always end up by saying, you know, parents play just as important role in helping and supporting their child during their teenage years as they do when they were babies or toddlers. It's just a different type of parenting and a different type of support, which enables the young person to make some autonomous decisions, to have some independence and freedom, and to take some of their own risks and experiment with their environment, but knowing that you have the kind of cushioning and containment of parental support. So parents are just as important to their growing teenager as they were when their teenager was smaller. And I think one way of thinking about it is that, you know, your teenager, I have 2 teenagers, and they're, you know, they're way taller than I am. And your teenager might look like an adult, but they don't have an adult brain yet. Their brain is still very much developing and has many years of development to go, as does their cognitive capacities in many areas and their social cognition. They need a lot of parental support still.
You've got 2 boys, haven't you?
Yeah.
So, big question. Who's tougher to deal with as an adolescent, boys or girls?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the only you know, anecdotally, each parent has their own story. And you hear troubles about adolescent girls, you hear troubles about adolescent boys. And the answer is, I have no idea. I've got 2 boys, so I don't have very good control experiment. But gender differences is an interesting question. So when we think of, there are some gender differences, like, for example, risk taking. I've mentioned risk taking already. If you think about risk taking, like, you know, taking physical risks, like, for example, car accidents, there's loads of data on car accidents and things like fatal car accidents from this country and basically all countries in the world. They record this data. It's very easy to record. Car insurance companies do it. And you can analyze that data, and what you find is that young people, as you might expect, have many more car accidents than older people. And one interesting fact is that younger people are much more likely to have a car accident when they're carrying passengers in the car with them, whereas older people, adults, are less likely, in fact, to have a car accident when they're carrying a passenger in the car. That improves your safety of driving if you're carrying friends in the car when you're an adult, but not when you're a younger person. And again, that goes back to this idea of peer influence on risk taking. But what you find, okay, so young people have many more car accidents than older people, and some of them are fatal, and there is a gender difference there, as you might imagine. It's largely young men who are responsible for these car accidents, especially the serious ones. So, you know, that's just one example of where there is a clear gender difference in real life data. But what's interesting is that when you carry out experiments in the lab, it's actually, very rarely do you find gender differences. And I think that's probably simply because we don't have the kind of numbers, the sample sizes in the lab that you do when you're looking at real life data from car insurance companies, which might be dealing with, you know, hundreds of thousands of data points. But in lab-based studies, you might have a few hundred people maximum in your study. And the key point here that I'm trying to make is that gender differences exist, but the overlap between the genders is so big that to see a difference, you really need very, very large numbers. So it's not that, what I'm saying is that it's not like boys are over here and girls are over here. There's a huge overlap. So you might have differences in the averages if you have big enough numbers, but mostly there are not really robust differences, at least in terms of cognition and behaviour during adolescence.
So we're having this discussion in comfortable Cambridgeshire in a modern democracy. I'm wondering whether adolescence is a recent invention and whether it exists all over the world in all cultures and all political systems.
Yeah, so there are arguments that adolescence is a kind of recent Western phenomenon invented about 100 years ago in the US, and that this extended period of development doesn't really exist as a biological phenomenon. That is one argument. Now, I would argue very strongly that that's not the case, and that in fact, this extended period of development that we now call adolescence is a unique period of biological, psychological, and social development. And I'll give you 3 reasons why. I mean, there are many more, but I'll give you 3. First of all, if you look at historical descriptions of adolescence, you see striking similarities with the way we typically describe this age group today. So if you go back as far as Socrates and Aristotle, they wrote about youth. They wrote a lot about youth, and they're using concepts like being impulsive, making bad decisions, being really influenced by their friends, being lazy, all these really negative stereotypes that we still, for some reason, have about young people today. So that's over 2,000 years ago. And you can look at historical descriptions since then. Shakespeare talks a lot about young people in the same negative way that we stereotype them today. So this is nothing new, this idea that we go through this period of youth and our behavior changes. Secondly, if you look across culture, so you mentioned different cultures. Yes, like I mentioned earlier, adolescents are treated really differently in different cultures. There are different societal expectations of this age group in, for example, Western high-income countries compared with non-Western low-income countries, where children are expected to become independent much, much earlier, and they're not really enabled to go through this extended period of development where they're still being looked after and educated. Okay, so that you might think then that their development would be really different, but actually when you go and test their development carefully using experimental tasks. So this is a study that I'm thinking of carried out by Larry Steinberg, who's one of the world experts on adolescence a few years ago. He looked at adolescent typical behavioral development in 11 different countries around the world, very different countries where societal expectations of this age group differed vastly. And what he found was, despite the differences in the way society treats adolescents, I mean, in some of these cultures, there's not even a word for adolescents. When you test their behavior, you see very, very similar patterns of behavior. So for example, you see that risk-taking increases during the teenage years, it peaks in the late teens, and then it decreases again in the 20s. And you see that in almost every culture, or he saw that in almost every culture, every country he included in his study. Whereas self-regulation, the ability to regulate your behavior and to stop yourself taking risks and to plan your actions, again, in almost every country, improved gradually during the teenage years and then stabilizes into the 20s. So even across cultures, there seem to be similarities in the way young people develop cognitively. And finally, my third point is across species. This is really interesting because humans are not the only species of animal to undergo this period of life, this period of adolescence. All species, all mammalian species, and some other species too, undergo a period of life between puberty and becoming fully sexually mature adults, and you can call that adolescence. Now, there's lots of research on what changes during adolescence in, for example, the brain and behavior and hormones. Across species, particularly in mice and rats. Mice and rats go through about 30 days of adolescence. And in those 30 days, scientists record their behavior and find that they change behavior in a kind of unique way during adolescence. For example, they start to take more risks, they start to explore their environment more, and they have really big changes in social behavior that are unique to this 30 days of adolescence. One study published a few years ago showed that adolescent mice drink more alcohol when they're with other mice, and that's not the case for adult mice. So adult mice drink around the same alcohol, whether they're with their cage mates or on their own, whereas adolescent mice, when they're with their cage mates, they drink significantly more alcohol than when they're on their own. So across history, across culture, and across species, you can find development, very significant development of behavior, and also what I haven't talked about is also changes in the brain.
Tell us about that. What is happening inside the human brain during this period? Is it all just about preparing for independence, going on your own?
Yeah, so the studies using MRI scanning that have been carried out over the last, say, 20 years have shown that the human brain develops for much, much longer and in a much more substantial way than we ever knew before we were able to scan it. And the changes are both in terms of the brain's structure and the brain's function. So, for example, structurally, there are lots of changes, but I'll focus on two. So, grey matter and white matter. They are the what the brain is composed of when you look at it in an MRI scan. And what we know now from many, many studies, this is findings that have been replicated many times, is that white matter increases during childhood, adolescence, and even into adulthood, the amount of white matter the brain contains. And that's important because white matter contains fibers, so fibers attached to each brain cell that are coated in something called myelin, which speeds up the transmission of signaling across the brain. And as you get older, we know that throughout childhood, adolescence, and early adulthood, we know that these fibers continue to become coated in this substance called myelin. So what that means is that as you're growing up, your brain's efficiency continues to improve, and that's seen as increased white matter in MRI scans. The second change is at the level of the grey matter. So grey matter, which is mostly found in the cortex of the brain's surface, the volume of grey matter increases during childhood. It's highest in late childhood, and then it declines during adolescence. There's actually a really huge decline in grey matter in most areas of the cortex across the period of adolescence and even into the 20s. Now that sounds bad. That sounds like, oh, there's some kind of neural atrophy or something. That's not the case. The decline in grey matter is thought to reflect really important neurodevelopmental processes, whereby the brain is becoming more efficient, and also whereby it's able to adapt to the environment it's in. So the brain is changing structurally. It's also changing in terms of its activity, how it's activated when you when you do particular cognitive tasks, for example. And your question was about which parts of the brain and why would it go through this period of development. So much of the brain is developing during adolescence. It's not just one single part, it's most of the brain. So you can think of it as the sensory regions of the brain, the parts of the brain that process vision and auditory information and movement, for example, develop much earlier than the rest of the brain, particularly the cortex, the surface of the brain, which, like, for example, prefrontal cortex and the parietal cortex, regions that are involved in more high-level cognitive tasks like planning and decision making and self-awareness and inhibiting inappropriate actions and understanding other people. I mean, the list is very long, but these higher level cognitive tasks and social tasks rely on regions of the brain that are undergoing substantial development throughout adolescence.
We talk about growing pains, don't we, to do with the physical development of someone during adolescence. So are there growing pains in the brain during that same period? Is that what causes teenagers stereotypically to be grumpy and moody, if you like?
It's a difficult question. So before we knew about how much the brain changes during adolescence, teenagers have always gone through mood swings. That's very, very well known. And again, there are historical descriptions of these mood swings in the teenage years, and they used to be put down almost entirely to the hormone changes that we all undergo when we go through puberty. So huge increases in sex hormones and also fluctuations in hormones. I think what I'd say is that there are huge changes in hormones, and they will have some effect on mood swings and self-regulation. But in addition to that, we now know that the brain undergoes huge amounts of change as well, and that will be probably a contributing factor. It's not only the brain, but also the cognitive processes that rely on the brain that are changing. So, for example, your ability to have deep self-awareness, to think about who you are, your identity, and particularly your social self-identity, that is how other people see you, that undergoes really profound change during adolescence, as does the ability to understand other people's perspectives. So suddenly to worry about what other people are thinking about you and how you're coming across in your peer group or your community. And also futuristic thinking about the future, thinking about your own future. All of these cognitive processes are changing during adolescence, we now know. And that's quite a burden on adolescents, to suddenly evolve these more sophisticated cognitive abilities, which perhaps make some adolescents worry about how they're coming across to other people, worry about their futures, worry about their self-identity. So
I'm interested in the effect of experience on the brain during this period. And of course, the gap year has become a thing, hasn't it, over the last generation or so, going away to do your own thing, go around the world, get your own experiences. So what's your thoughts on that part of the development of the brain?
So we know from research with animals, research with humans, that this period of life is a period in which we need to explore our environments and experience new things, novelty. And not surprisingly, we find that human and animal adolescents, non-human animal adolescents, seek novelty more than they do in adulthood. So they seek out new situations, and they want to experience new things and explore their environment. And that's probably for good evolutionary reason. That, as I've said many times, the whole point about adolescence is to undergo this developmental period in which you come out the other end as an independent adult. And to do that, you need to learn by trial and error. You need to explore your environment. You need to learn to make, kind of practice making your own decisions. So I do think of an amount of risk-taking and exploration and experimentation is really important for adolescents to go through. But of course, at the same time, and this, we talked about parenting earlier, adults are really important to provide scaffolding and to provide education and to kind of empower young people with the information that they need to go and explore their environments and take risks, but take kind of calculated risks that hopefully won't go wrong.
I want to move on to talk about the effect of big events, big worldwide events, on a generation's development as an adolescent. We know, of course, the effect of the First World War had on, well, the whole century to follow, the Second World War. The First World War, young men were going to war at 17 and 18, second in the Second World War. And also the Vietnam War, I think the average age of a soldier there, a US soldier, was 19, so bang in the middle of adolescence. And of course, it's not a war, but we've had the restrictions of the last 18 months or so, the effect of COVID across the world on the movement, behaviour, the restrictions that have happened. So is that going to be a big event, even a cataclysmic event in the development of a generation?
Yeah, so, I mean, I just thought when you were talking about, there was a song, wasn't there, about the average age of the Vietnam soldier being 19, and the fact that there was actually a song about it suggests that even back then, was that in the 80s, I think that song came out, even back then there was something shocking about that. There was something that really made you think, my God, that's a young age. The average age, obviously there were much younger people as well, and just because they're facts doesn't mean they're a good thing. I mean, when I hear those statistics, I find them pretty shocking, because I know how much development the brain still has to go in a 19-year-old. The brain is not fully mature at that point. I mean, that's not to say that 19-year-olds can't be independent. Of course, most are. They go off to university or to get jobs, or in this case, they go to war, and they can do those things. They're physically capable of it. They're cognitively capable of quite a lot by then, but there's still a lot of development to go. So I think we really need to take that into account, that this period of life doesn't just, the adolescence and adolescent brain development doesn't just end, for example, at 18, when we're legally adults. It continues for many more years after that. And yes, so the main question is COVID, and particularly the measures that have been put in place around the world to mitigate the spread of the COVID virus, the coronavirus, and how that will affect young people. I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that, it's not nice for any age group. Every age group is, I think, probably suffering and probably will be affected by this for many years to come. But when we think about young people, we know that from many years of research now, we know that young people require social interaction and social learning in order for development to take place, and it also helps their mental health. We know that being isolated is a very big risk factor for mental health problems, actually at all ages, but particularly in young people. And as we know, one of the very main mitigating measures to try to prevent the spread of coronavirus is to restrict social contact. Of course it is. I mean, that makes kind of obvious public health sense because that's how the virus spreads. But we really don't know how restricting face-to-face social contact affects the development of the brain and mental health. That's a sort of what we would call a natural experiment, and not a very nice one. We know from, we just don't know, because this has never really happened before. At least it's never been studied rigorously in humans. But we do know from animals, for example, mice and rats, that if you isolate mice and rats during their period of adolescence, so during the 30 days of adolescence that they go through, that has more damaging effects on brain development and behavioral development and mental health than the same social isolation either before adolescence or in adulthood. There's something about this period of adolescence which makes us particularly vulnerable to the effects of social isolation. So it is a worry. It's something that I've been concerned about for the last almost a year now, because I work on the social needs of adolescents and the really vital role that peers play in adolescent development. Now, one thing to say here is that adolescents are very used to connecting with each other online, so through social media and through gaming and other online platforms. And in some ways, that's a great reassurance, because although their face-to-face social contact is really restricted, at least they can maintain communication with friends through social media. And that might help to mitigate the potentially harmful effects of depriving them of face-to-face social interaction during this period of life. But we just don't know. And there are many research studies that have been carried out in the last year around the world looking at mental health or mental ill health in children and adolescents and also adults during this pandemic. And they have generally shown, I haven't been involved in any, but lots of my colleagues like Tamsin Ford and Kathy Cresswell and Daisy Fancourt, lots of really excellent researchers around this country and also abroad, have shown that actually it's a really mixed finding. There are lots of individual differences. Some children and young people seem to be absolutely fine and have not been negatively affected in terms of their mental health. But overall, there has been an increase in mental health problems in young people in the last year. I mean, remember that already there was a bit of a mental health crisis in young people, at least in this country and in the USA. Even before the pandemic hit, there were very large numbers of teenagers who reported having mental health problems, many more than, say, 10 or 20 years ago. And this pandemic, for multiple reasons, I imagine, not just the social restrictions, but also the anxiety around coronavirus, maybe grief if family members have died from it, are associated with an increase in mental health problems. So it's a real worry.
I'm interested in your view on how adolescents have been talked to and talked about during this pandemic, because very often in sort of generalizations, they get the blame for the spread or for the social occasions that happen. And it seems very often that governments, and this has happened certainly right across the Western world, have spoken to them from on high, if you like, to order them to do something, tell them to do something. Is that the approach to get adolescents to listen, I wonder?
So I would say no. So my group and lots of labs around the world work on the question of peer influence in adolescence, how adolescents influence each other. And I'll just give you one example of that. So there's been, there was a study a few years ago in the USA looking at peer-led anti-bullying interventions in schools. So they took 56 middle schools, so that's schools for kids aged between about 11 and 15 in New Jersey, and they divided them randomly into two groups. So in one group, the schools ran their anti-bullying campaigns as usual, led by the teachers. And in the other group of schools, the researchers educated the students themselves, actually a select group of students in each school. They educated them about the harmful effects of bullying and social exclusion. And then they incentivized those groups of students to run their own campaigns. They ran their own anti-bullying campaigns, like parties and debates and wristband campaigns and poster campaigns. And those schools in which the students themselves led the anti-bullying campaigns showed a 25% reduction in incidents of bullying and social exclusion across the ensuing year, compared with the control schools where the anti-bullying campaigns were led by the teachers. And what that suggests is that young people themselves have a lot of influence on each other, more so than adults do in certain contexts like bullying. And this has also been shown for other health behaviours like anti-smoking. So when these campaigns, which, you know, there've been so many of them now around the world, to try to encourage young people to adhere to the social distancing rules, for example, or lockdown rules, they almost all have involved adults basically telling young people what to do and blaming and shaming them. We had in this country, we had a "Don't Kill Your Granny" campaign back in the autumn, early autumn, aimed at young people. But there's no evidence from research that that's going to do any good. And in fact, it really could backfire, because young people could feel really victimized and blamed, and kind of push back against that. And in fact, what we've argued, we wrote a paper on this a long time ago, actually, right at the beginning of the pandemic, with my one of my PhD students, Jack Andrews, and our colleague Lucy Folkes. We argued that in order to encourage young people to make positive decisions around social distancing and to follow the rules, young people themselves should be empowered to run their own campaigns. So they should have a voice in this debate. Their voices have been basically silent. They haven't been allowed to have a voice, really, and that's really the wrong attitude. It's just not going to work as well as if they have a voice at the table and they design and run their own campaigns. There's lots of evidence that young people would listen much more to each other than they do to politicians, for example, telling them what to do.
You spoke earlier on about how your science had changed just in the time that you've been involved in it. And I have to say that our world has changed completely from since I was an adolescent. It's got faster, it's got more hectic. It's gone from a couple of television stations to hundreds, and radio stations as well, the iPhone and the iPod and all these other things that go on social media, etc., etc. Is it just a coincidence that all of that has happened at the same time as anxiety and depression and worry in adolescence has increased?
Yeah, so we know from lots of large-scale studies that the prevalence of depression and anxiety particularly, and other conditions like self-harm and eating disorders, has increased in the last 20 years, particularly in girls, adolescent girls. And the question is, why is this? I mean, it's the kind of million-dollar question, and lots of researchers are trying to figure out why this increase has happened. Is it simply because we've become more aware of these disorders, and also they've acquired less stigma as the years have gone by? So young people are more willing to talk about them, teachers notice them, parents notice them, and are more likely to take their child to the doctor about them. That's one explanation. But the clinicians that I work with also say it's not just that. There's something over and above that and they believe, like, for example, Tamsin Ford, a professor of psychiatry at Cambridge, has written really nice papers on this, arguing that there has actually been a real increase in the prevalence of these conditions over the last 10 or 20 years. And then the question is why? What's changed in the last 10 or 20 years, couple of decades, to account for this increase in mental health problems in young people? And I mean, like you say, masses has changed. So it's very difficult to disentangle all those different factors and to pinpoint one change in the environment that has contributed to this increase in depression and anxiety and other mental health conditions. Now, one factor, and you touched on it, that people jump on is the internet and social media and screen time. The problem is that the studies are just really not clear cut, actually, that screen time has caused an increase in depression and anxiety. So the general finding is that excessive screen time, I mean, we're talking many, many, many hours every day, is associated with lower mood in young people. But equally, no screen time is also associated with lower mood. And a sort of moderate amount of screen time is associated with the highest levels of mood, the most kind of functional level of mood. So this is called the Goldilocks effect. People like my colleague, Amy Orban at Cambridge, are really world leaders in studying this effect. And what Amy Orban says, although I don't really want to put words in her mouth, but we work together, and what she has told me is that what really matters in terms of the association between screen time and well-being in young people is not just the amount. It's not as simple as that. It's what they're looking at. So what websites, when they're looking at it. In the middle of the night is not so great. In the middle of the day might be less bad. And also how they're interacting with it. So there's some evidence that actively engaging in social media, so actively communicating with your friends on social media, is quite functional, and it is, especially now in when we're all locked in our own houses, is quite a good thing. Whereas passively scrolling through other people's news feeds and not engaging, that's associated with lower well-being. So in other words, it's really complicated, this relationship, if there is one, between screen time and well-being. So what else has changed in the last 20 years? Well, I mean, huge amounts has changed, but one thing I would say is that there is evidence that in this country, education has become more pressurized, and children and young people are doing more and more exams. They're being tested more and more with SATs and linear GCSEs, more GCSE exams. And if you ask young people, what's the most stressful aspect of your life, then survey after survey shows you that they will point to academic pressure and exams. We have to listen to young people and not just decide on their behalf what's stressing them out and what's causing low well-being. Maybe we should listen to this and think about whether this the enormous amount of exams that young people are made to do is really the right way to assess their development at a period of life in which is characterized by vulnerability to developing mental health problems. Finally, I would say that perhaps actually social media, or at least online media, does play a role in this. That this is also anecdotal, this is just my view, but I think young people are exposed to more news than they were, or at least when I was growing up. I was very rarely exposed to any news at all, just occasionally in the evening on the TV. Whereas now news is 24/7, you can't get away from it, you're bombarded with it. It's often bad news because that's what gets people to click links and listen to the radio or whatever. And I wonder what harm that does to the developing brain, constantly being bombarded with scary news, and news about that will affect them as well. So for example, around climate change, that's information that puts a lot of pressure on them thinking about their own futures. And what surprises me is working with young people, how many of them talk about being worried about their own futures, being worried about things like getting jobs, getting on the housing ladder, and things like climate change. I just don't remember when I was a teenager worrying so much about my own future. So all of those things together, I think, have changed over the last 20 years and might at least contribute to the increased prevalence of mental health problems.
Yeah, and the other thing they seem to worry more about than my time, or as far as I know anyway, is their body image, their self-image. And of course, there's been an explosion in TV programs where, particularly reality ones, where that is to the fore. Is that a force for good or not, or is it irrelevant to you?
I completely agree, and I think one of the ways you can kind of see how much pressure there is on body image these days for both boys and girls is that experts who work on eating disorders and other kind of body dysmorphia disorders have documented over the last 10 or 20 years that the number of eating disorders the number of boys and young men with eating disorders has really increased. It used to be a kind of girls thing, a women's thing. Because for decades there's been a lot of pressure, or forever in fact, there's been a lot of pressure on women to look a certain way, but now that pressure seems to be there for boys and young men as well. And perhaps because of that and this bombardment of information about how your body should look and how much time you should spend in the gym and how to get particularly ripped or whatever, puts this pressure on young men. And clinical psychologists and psychiatrists are seeing it in terms of an increased prevalence of eating disorders, even in boys and men. So yeah, I completely agree. And I mean, that's a good example of something we've already always known, which is mental health problems are not only biological. It's not just about your genetic makeup and the way your brain develops, but also about your environment. And being bombarded with images about how you should look and kind of social pressure on how you should look is an example of an environmental factor that I think has increased prevalence of certain conditions.
You've talked earlier on about how much has changed over the last 20 or 30 years in your science. And of course, the poor GP and other doctors have very often been the people trying to second guess what's going on in the young person's mind. And very often they have turned to the prescription pad to try and deal with something. In your view, what place do prescription drugs have in the treatment of adolescent mental health, if any?
I'm not a psychiatrist, so I can't comment on that other than to say that from what I've read, antidepressants can be really life-saving for even teenagers who are severely depressed, in combination with talking therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy. But yeah, I mean, I think that the way to tackle this question is to say that we are going through a mental health crisis, particularly for young people right now. This has been the case for many years, and it's only going to get worse because of COVID. And yet the national spend on mental health research and mental health clinical practice, CAMS, so the mental health interventions and practice for children and young people, is a tiny, tiny fraction of what is spent on physical health problems. And yet we know that mental health problems are so prevalent and causing so much damage across society and in schools. It's an urgent problem.
I'd like to try and finish on, as we get towards the end of our chat, on something positive. Can you tell us about things that happen in your lab or that are being developed, which are changing things for the better, our understanding or our way to interact with adolescents, that's really a force for good?
I would say that I've been working with adolescents for 20 years, studying adolescent brain development, and one thing I have noticed is that more and more adolescents are being included in the conversation. So, for example, there are scientists around the world. One who particularly comes to mind is my colleague Evelina Kroon, who's a professor in the Netherlands. And she now runs a kind of citizen science lab where she involves young people in the design of experiments and in the studies themselves, not just as participants, as volunteers, but as scientists. And that is just such a big change, because that was absolutely not in existence 20 years ago, as far as I knew. And that's happening much more. It's also happening more with interventions like school-based interventions, and young people are being given more of a voice. I also appreciate the fact that young people are, again, it's a similar idea, are being included in, like, we talk much more openly about things like mental health problems with young people, and other things like in PSHE lessons. I mean, in PSHE lessons, they talk about all sorts of subjects, really complex societal or personal subjects that absolutely were off the cards when I was growing up as a teenager. They were just never discussed. And that gives me hope that young people will be included more in the conversation, and society will be more inclusive of this really important age group.
You wrote a book called Inventing Ourselves, The Secret Life of the Teenage Brain. What is there still to be discovered that you really want to know about the teenage brain?
I mean, there's masses. It's such a new field. This is a very, very young science. It's only 2 decades that we've understood that the teenage brain even changes at all. That's very young in the whole history of science. And so there are masses of questions remaining. One question that I will mention here is individual differences. So most of what we know about the brain, when you read papers on brain development in adolescence or cognitive development in adolescence, you see results from averages. So you average out the development in the teenage brain compared with what the adult brain looks like. But of course, there is no average teenager, and there is no average teenage brain. The individual differences are vast, and you can see them in the brain scans. You can see how individuals' brains differ hugely in terms of, for example, the speed of development, what develops when development stops and sort of stabilizes off. Those individual differences are super important. We don't understand them. For example, we don't understand what are the genetic or environmental contributions that determine how your brain develops and when it develops. We don't understand what the individual differences in development mean. For example, one major hypothesis that colleagues around the world are looking at is that perhaps the slope of development, so how fast certain brain regions develop during adolescence, is a kind of biological risk factor for the development of certain developmental conditions or mental health problems. That's a hypothesis that's currently being looked at. And we also don't know about the consequences of individual differences. So if you're someone whose brain undergoes really rapid development early in adolescence and stabilizes earlier than other people's brains, what are the consequences for that in adulthood? What kind of adult will that make you? We just don't know the answers to any of these questions. And I think that's, there's a lot of exciting science yet to be done.
I look forward to our next conversation. Professor Sarah-Jayne Blakemore, thank you so much.
Thank you.